Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our meeting of Monday, November 22nd. We are having a speaker challenge at the moment, so we're just trying to hunt down our speaker.
Don, he just emailed me. It's going to be good. It's going to be okay.
You'll be here shortly.
Yes.
So while we are waiting for our speaker to join us, oh, he's there, and he's wow. So, good morning, Ben.
Good morning.
Wonderful, thank you. So
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to Jerry to introduce you.
So good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ben Porchuk. Ben has over 2 decades of experience in ecology, nonprofit management, environmental consulting, and sustainable living. After living off-grid for over a decade, Ben now lives in a densely populated area of London where his property consists of over 200 species of native plants, including a wetland, all visited by many species of wildlife, seldom observed in the downtown of a city like London. Ben uses his skills and experience to help recover natural habitats on rural and urban properties using native plants in wetlands, prairies, forests, and more. Ben is about to launch a webinar called bringingforestshome.com, a project designed to help recover habitats, reverse climate change, and get the most out of the private spaces for rejuvenation. Ben is truly one of the greatest local environmentalists, and many Londoners, including his colleagues, have their highest regards for him. He is a leader who truly thinks globally and acts locally, and we are very fortunate to have him living in our community. Ben, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So it's been a while since I started on this journey with native plants, and to be honest, I'm like pretty much a lot of people. I've got a lot of interests. I really love sports. I've got a family. It's a really big part of my life, 4 kids. And, starting on this, I actually was in the field of carpentry, and I worked in my dad's business for a while. And then I ended up finding myself on Pelee Island, where I thought I would just live for a few years. I was researching. I got a big grant to study the blue racer snake of Pelee Island. And before I knew it, I was there for 12 years. I lived off the grid, wind turbines, solar panels, composting toilets, and really becoming a part of the community. And it was there that I struggled with a lot of things that I recognized that we have just rampant across our society, is that we're disconnected to so many things. When you look at some of the challenges across the earth right now, we're only in climate change right now because we've disconnected from one of the key things that supports us. And that's very similar to the mass extinction event that we're in. And a lot of people will say, oh yeah, that's kind of for environmentalists that are concerned about the loss of species. And quickly we realize that once we reconnect, that we are intricately related to other species, and the web is very delicate. And so this is a really fun topic for me. I could be serious about it. But instead of saying, oh, I really can't do anything, when I moved off Pelee Island, I thought, why don't I start where I am in a city and see what we can do? And so this is kind of the culmination of this webinar that I'm putting together, Bringing Forests Home, so that if anybody out there thinks they can't do anything, we need to really think again and look to our homes. There's so much we can do. And before we know it, we have a few people on our streets and we're all making a difference, and we're still living our lives and have lots of different interests. And it's not just all about the environment. So I'm going to talk about specifically bringing some plants back to an urban setting. Like I said, I love sports. I love family and connection and community. Who doesn't love a big lawn? And yet when we look at this across North America, it really is the largest cultivated crop that we have. Everywhere we look, lawns are being grown for either sod or to create seed. And we can still have lawn and share it with other species and start to pull ourselves out of some of the holes that I was describing earlier. One of my goals is to reverse something like this. This is an article I found a few years ago in this BBC Nature that says essentially that cities are driving plants to extinction as cities start to expand in some of the more productive regions, a lot of the plants start to disappear because we tend to get plants from other parts of the world to put into our gardens. And we tend to have these big lawns that I was just showing you. And so it really doesn't have to be this way. There are some great cities that are leading and showing that you can have 25, 30, 35% of the city can be in natural areas. And then we can start to look at the other 65 to 70% and find ways that we can coexist together so that we can really start to improve habitats, climate change, all these sorts of things. And so some of the extremes that we might look at, I already showed you a lawn. Here's another one on the left side, which is beautiful. The top right is one of these extremes that I kind of was for a while on Pelee Island. I mean, this is a livable house. It's actually called an earthship. And on top of the earthship, which is made out of rammed earth tires, there's a prairie. And there are a lot of rare species. And then out in the lawn, of course, there's a pool, but it's not just any pool. It's called a pond pool. You might be able to see the outline there of where you can swim, but all along the margins where the pond overflows, it's free for wild species to come in and join and share the property. And so this is kind of an extreme version that isn't available to all people. And then if you're in London, which I think most people here are today, if you came by 37 Elmwood Avenue East, this is my place at the bottom right there. And as Jerry mentioned, I've now got over 250 species of native plants in the front, the side, and the backyards. I still have a really big yard that I can entertain, play sports with the kids, and really start to see wildlife return, which I'm about to show you. And of course, I mentioned climate change, and a lot of people are that talk about this kind of thing want to talk about things like BC, you know, the hottest day on record in North America in late June, which burned the city of Lytton, to the point today where a lot of these mountainsides that have been denuded of old growth forest are now sliding down onto our infrastructure. Of course, we see this. Of course, we have compassion, and we can really start to turn this around. And so this is a little tiny bit of the doomsday. I'm talking about native plants. Some people might not really know what native plant is. The top left is a tiger lily it's called a Michigan lily, which is a native plant from eastern North America. It's very closely related to the tiger lily that's found further out west. Then there's the spotted lily on the right-hand side. That's from China. You can see in the globe where it's from. Very similar. They evolved for hundreds of thousands of years separately, so they're different. They have different insects that will come and pollinate them, and they are native plants to their own region. But when we move them across the world, they lose a lot of their function, even though they can survive. Some biologists, entomologists talk about a lot of the plants that we find in our nurseries, and we call them plastic plants because they are effectively as valuable as a plastic plant in the environment when we move them around the world. I mean, they might have some butterflies that come in, some of them that will try to get nectar, but they really don't provide that function that's critical for our local ecology to work. And of course, you are familiar with this plant, the plant of Ontario, the trillium. We actually have 6 species in Ontario, and only one of them is endangered. I use a lot of these in different projects. I love trilliums. They actually will live for 30 years. They take 7 years to flower. And, it's an early, what we call a spring ephemeral. We can find a lot of beauty in some of the plants that we have locally. The problem is what we see so often is what we want, right? So we'll get a lot of people looking at properties like this, which are beautiful to my eye, is probably as well to your eye. And people will ask, where did you get that beautiful plant? Like it's flowering beautifully, it's low to the ground, it lasts for a long time. And so we'll go to nurseries and we'll find these plants there. But our native plants, so the ones that are indigenous to this region, are really not accessible at these places. And so we buy what we see, right? So this is a big challenge in trying to turn around the local ecology. The other big challenge is that when we develop sites, and as much as I'm an environmentalist, I'm a developer. I live in a house that was built in 1890. This house probably had, you know, 800,000 year old trees here before it was a house, right? So, you know, it's so easy to say, oh, we have to stop development, but no, we're growing. We need places to grow. But when we grow in these places, we really have to take care of things. So things from the soil to reestablishing the local vegetation that was there. So we really have to know what was there, and we can go to people like me and others that have this experience. And once we go to a site and prepare it, if you see here, you know, removing the topsoil, which you've probably heard of, takes decades, if not hundreds of years to recover, to essentially build houses or establish this turf grass, which at the bottom right, this turf grass is actually called Kentucky bluestem. I showed it to you earlier in the lawn. It's not from Kentucky, it's actually from Asia, and it only has a 5 centimeter root. And it's really challenging for the soil because it doesn't give the soil diversity that's required to support our native plants. And if you look here at the top left, what our native plants do is they actually build the soil. And it's not just from dropping needles and leaves and twigs that things like salamanders and slugs and other things will feed on. It's actually this product that the roots produce that's called exudates. And exudates are these tiny little sticky things that you see on the tips of the roots. The sugars, carbohydrates, and they're proteins. And they attract fungi and bacteria. The bacteria becomes a glue around the plant root system. The fungi aerates the soil, and they work in synergy with the plant. And the plant actually requires them to get nutrients and to build more soil. And the way this happens is tiny little microbes will attack these bacteria and these fungi trying to get at the root system. The bacteria and the fungi counter attack the microbes. And when some of them die, the microbes and the bacteria and the fungi, that's what the plant actually uses to get its 47 essential nutrients and minerals. Before that, of course, plants can get sugars by photosynthesizing sunlight, but it's critical for these elements for the plants to uptake them. And of course, you know, there's a lot of life in soil. And I won't get into it, but you see the top right, there's an earthworm there. Earthworms aren't actually native to our region. And if you think about that for a moment, everybody seems to think, oh, earthworms equal good soil. No, not here, because earthworms will eat through this leaf litter and through a lot of the bacteria and the fungi that the plants really need. So we really need to establish our native plants to help bring our soil back. And it's not just for things like plant diversity and animal diversity, but the more bacteria and fungi we have there, the more they will hold the plants in place, the more they aerate the soil, which allows the water to run through the soil instead of over the surface. And when it runs over the surface, like we get in a lot of cities, you know what happens is we get major floods, we get tons of erosion, and we say, wow, it's climate change. Yes, it's climate change, but a big part of the factor is that we don't have our native plants established. And so here again is my place. Quite a few years ago at the very beginning, I'm not a designer, I'm an ecologist, and I actually practice a lot of yoga, and I do a lot of other different things as well for my income. But it's very simple to come up with a plan, and if you can't figure it out yourself, there are a lot of people that can help you. And when I'm talking about establishing native plants, I'm not saying rip out any of the plants like the Rose of Sharon, any of the plants that you have now. You might want to take some of them out. Some of them are really invasive and start to take over not just your own yard, like some of the ivies, the periwinkle, but once they get in the wild, they start to take over a lot of our natural areas and reduce the diversity, which again makes us more prone to climate change. But this is where we start, a simple design looking at lighting considerations, space. It's like any kind of landscape design. The other thing about native plants that I will harp about a little bit, and a lot of people will, if you look at books like Bringing Nature Home, native plants, unlike plants from other parts of the world, have insects that are co-evolved with them. These insects feed larger insects, which then feed things like birds and feed larger birds and mammals. It's just how we convert the plant parts. So the photosynthesis gets converted into protein. This is actually one of my favorite types of insects that looks like a bee or a wasp, but it's actually a type of fly. They're called bee mimics or hoverflies. And they're really critical because they're one of the first things that comes out in the early spring to pollinate plants. And when they pollinate plants, the birds that are migrating back will see them and will feed on them. And this is one of the key things that triggers spring to start in our woodlands. Another really fascinating early flowering plant that attracts a lot of insects, and not just insects that fly, is called the bloodroot. The flower is at the top left, the leaves there at the bottom left, and you can see kind of a long boat-shaped seed pod that forms at the top right. When you look at those seeds a little more closely, you see they have this fleshy white spot on the side of them. These are actually called eliosomes, and eliosomes are found on things like trilliums, mayapple, large flower bellwort, and especially on these bloodroot. Bloodroot will actually flower in April, and by the time late May rolls around, the seed pods are ready. And it's really remarkable what happens next is that these fleshy bits are actually high in lipids and proteins and fatty acids, and ants will hone in on them and they will pull them away down deep into their ant colony, pull off the eliosome, and rear their young with them, which is remarkable. Their young will actually become mature ants faster than on any other food source because they're so nutritious. Then, when the ants are done with the seeds, there's a special caste of ants that know where to take the seeds. And some people call them kind of the garbage ants. But no, they actually take the seeds and they plant them throughout the forest in the perfect conditions for the plant to grow again. So some will say actually it's permaculture, it's farming, and it's really ecology because when you start to look at some of these connections, this happens commonly. And so I showed you bloodroot on the previous slide, and here's again the trillium, which also have eliosomes. So some of these connections within our forests in the east are just remarkable. And all we have to do is pay attention to see this. This is a really quick snapshot of my front yard, which would look like any forest. You've got Jack in the pulpit in the top left, some trilliums in the top right that are fading, maidenhair fern, and some other plants that will be coming up a little later in the season. So you can see that it looks kind of pretty. It's not spectacular. It's got some space between it. I'm learning a little bit. But again, can you live with this in parts of your garden? Can you live with this in order to contribute to the improvement of our urban ecology, which has really been tanking lately, and of course, climate change? And I think, of course, we can, because there's a lot of beauty associated with this. This is one of the showstoppers in my front garden. It's the large yellow lady slipper. I had 48 of these, and I live in, Wortley Village is kind of a mixed neighborhood in terms of haves and have-nots. There are a lot of people that wander by, that will dig things occasionally out of my garden. So I've lost some of these plants to people who needed them more than me. I'm down to about 17 because some of them have faded, but a lot of people will just stop and point to each other and kind of look and wonder and look at my place and wonder what's slightly different about this. And of course, what's slightly different is we're really honing in on these native plants for a number of reasons, one of which can be sheer beauty. Another sheerly beautiful plant is this butterfly milkweed. And we all know of milkweeds for monarchs and the incredible journey that they have. A lot of people don't know that we have 11 species, different species of milkweeds in Ontario. A lot of people focus on the common one, which is more of a pink flower, but it's actually this one that's preferred to a lot of butterflies to nectar, right, to get sugar. But the monarch and a few others will actually lay their eggs on the leaves of this plant. So it's not necessarily the sugar. And this, again, is the association of insects to native plants, not just for sugar, not just for a quick snack, but actually for reproduction. We have about 5 or 6 species of hub trees that are critical for this. The number one, the top left, is the oak tree. We actually have close to 33 subspecies of oak trees found in Ontario. They account for 500 species of lepidopterans, so moths and butterflies that require the oaks in order to lay their eggs on the leaves or on the twigs for them to reproduce. So these are critical. Other critical hub native species on the far right there is the black cherry. The bottom left is the American beech. Other critical ones are yellow birch and white birch, and then a lot of our native willows. So not the weeping willow, but the black willow, the peach leaf willow. We've got about 7 or 8 really critical willows that if we planted in our yard, we would support insect populations immensely. Some of the insects that are found on only some of these plants are spectacular. These are insects like these giant Saturn moths. They're also like the Luna moth, the imperial moth, the sphinx moth. They're silkworm moths. These moths only live for a week, maybe 2 at most, as the adults, and they have no mouth parts. They're usually only active at night. They only pupate from the cocoon in order to breed, find a mate, breed, lay their eggs, and die. I've started to hatch a lot of these, and it's a project that I'm working on with Carolinian Canada, where I'm meeting a lot of different people. And as soon as they hatch out, I say, hey, I've got some Luna moths. Do you guys want to come and take pictures? And I'm really trying to pair the moths with different people to show how, some of our regular functions are very similar to other species that are among us. This young woman is standing in front of a tree, which is called the shagbark hickory, which you can see the long leaves behind her. This is the critical food source for the Luna moth. And the Luna moth, of course, has a lot of mystical associations with it because of its wonderful appearance. And you can see that, these fake eyes on it are what actually help protect it. But it only needs protection for a couple of weeks. It will overwinter in the chrysalis or the cocoon and then hatch out probably by July to early August, survive for a couple of weeks, lay its eggs, which turn into caterpillars, which feed on the leaves, in this case, of the shagbark hickory, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger until they turn into the cocoon. So it's a wonderful story, and I've had so many people super excited about meeting these moths and taking pictures. Another thing is that a lot of our birds, especially birds that are uncommon, really need caterpillars to survive. When I lived on Pelee Island and there were tons of oak trees down there compared to here, this was one of the most common birds around my cabin. It's called the yellow-billed cuckoo. It feeds exclusively on caterpillars. It's 1.5 size the times of a robin. And this bird would regularly come close to me where I could get wonderful images. I'd just sit really quietly. And so the more we bring back these trees, the more we'll get birds like this and other animals. And again, I really love to make the case that why don't we share our landscapes more further with this? It's not only for the utilitarian need of survival and reducing climate change, but the moments that you can have with species like this really enrich your life. I'm going to talk really quickly. Do I have a few minutes left? Yeah, okay, great. Like I mentioned, in my backyard, this is where I have the wetland ecosystem. The bottom left is the first year that I created this. My daughter in the middle there was, I think, about 9. She's 23 now. So I've had this system for a long time. If you look at the top left, that was like the second or the third year when I just got it established. But before even I got it established, in the bottom left of that photo, you'll see a dragonfly, the top part of the dragonfly. This is the largest dragonfly in North America. It's called the swamp darner. It's bigger than my palm. And when I was setting up the pond, these dragonflies were flying all around me, 5 or 6 of them. And I called my friend who's an expert in dragonflies. I managed to get a picture and I said, hey, Pete, what's going on? What is this? And he said, where'd you get that picture? And I said, my backyard. And he said, no, you didn't. I said, yes, I did. He said, tell me more about it. Where did you get the picture? And I said, well, I'm putting in a pond. And he said, this is the swamp darner. I usually only ever see them in a big forest when there's an opening in the canopy. So there are a bunch of mature trees like my backyard, small opening in the canopy. They look for the reflection of water and they lay their eggs in small little pools. But he said, you have to put a piece of wood on the edge of the water. So I had nothing but a liner and a piece of wood, and I put the wood down and they started laying eggs at the water line. And it was just amazing. They survived for 8 years under the water as a really super fast jet propelled predator feeding on mosquito larvae, right? So what an amazing thing to have around. And every year, new females will come back and lay. And when I clean out the pond, I'm really careful and I find the larvae of these and I put them back in the pond because I know they're doing a great service. This is what I call a three-stage vertical cat flow wetland. So I actually have a biological filter. I've got a really deep pond at the bottom left you can see in front of the kids. Then I've got a high reservoir with a waterfall, and you can see it completed on the right there. And then on the far left, I have a pond without the fish where a trickle goes over. I get a lot of birds during spring migration that will come to feed and drink here. Migrating songbirds will listen for the sound of water and they'll stop off at your pond and they'll drink there. That other cell is for dragonflies that like areas without fish and they like more sunshine. So I have sunlight going on there. These are three species that I had frequent this pond. So the 12-spotted skimmer, the common whitetail, and then the painted skimmer at the bottom left. It's just spectacular what comes in. And we'll sit there in the sunlight and then breed in this pond. I also, of course, this isn't anything super exciting for a lot of you. I had American toads come and breed. It was so successful for toad reproduction that at one point on the open lawn around the pond, there was nothing but tadpoles everywhere. And then not long after that, I called up my friend Pete again and I said, "Hey, Pete, I've seen this screech owl on the left here." And he looked at the picture and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's an eastern screech owl, but it's got red in it. It's an intergrade between the red, the eastern, and the western." And then I sent him another picture a few days later, and he said, "That's a different owl." And he said, "Look for cavities." And I went back, and there was a weeping willow, not very big. I was going to cut it down, and my wife said, "No, no, I love weeping willows." And I said, "It's not native. I really want to plant a native tree here." And she said, "No, leave it. I love the willow." I said, "Okay, of course." And on the other side of the willow, there was this hole, and I looked up in it, and then up on the deck the very next day, this is where we have coffee in our second floor walkout from our bedroom. There are these three hatchling screech owls. I couldn't believe it. And they were only like maybe 6 or 7 feet away from where we would sit on our deck and have coffee. And they were there for a few weeks. And then it wasn't long after that I noticed that some of them were crashing in broad daylight onto the lawn. And a lot of neighbors came over. And my daughter and I went out there to see if they're okay. And one of the adults came down and they flew up. And then we went back inside. They kept crashing in broad daylight. What were they doing? These owls were teaching their babies to feed on the toadlets on the lawn. And so this is where I kind of went, boom, wow. So I created a pond. All of this thing came to the pond. Now we have toadlets everywhere. How are they going to survive? And the answer is they're not all going to survive, right? They're going to feed the owls. And of course, the owls are attracted because we've invited everything else back, right? And so this is the exact cycle that I'm talking to you about. And it's super exciting. And it's so easy for us to make this impact. And I'm not saying do everything that I've done. And here's one of the hatchlings that was crashing on the lawn. I'm saying start with a native plant, start with something to move along the path so that we can help reconcile our neighborhoods from, concrete and asphalt to something that's a little more that starts to share. And of course, when we talk about sharing, we start to change the story. And so why not rewrite the story where an international team of botanists has compared extinction rates of the plants, and we've found that cities actually are helping us recover endangered plants. They're helping us improve our urban biodiversity. They're helping reverse climate change, all while we're doing all the things we want, and we're not being lectured at by people saying you have to save the world, you have to stop what you're doing. You don't. We have to just change some of the things we're doing. So I encourage you to join Carolinian Canada's site called inthezonegardens.ca. This is where you can get a lot of free things to help you on your journey to establish one or more native plants on your property. You get a lot of free books right away that will help you do it yourself. And as we mentioned earlier on, that bringingforesthome.com is a webinar that I'm going to be releasing soon that will really help people a little bit more along the journey. And, I'm super excited that you joined me here today. And I really want to thank you again for the invitation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So if anyone has questions, please use the raise hand function in Zoom to ask your question. Go ahead, Kirk.
Hey, Ben, thanks for that awesome presentation. That was really informative. I have a question for you about how do you recommend when you're talking to someone who sort of thinks the be all and end all is that perfect, pristine lawn that almost looks like it's fake because it's just so perfect, and there's not a single thing that's not a blade of grass. How do you start this conversation of the benefits of what you have versus this perfect lawn? Because I find that's the first thing. And then the second part to that question is, you talked about it brings a lot of bugs, it brings a lot of animals. And I think in our modern society, we're not like, ooh, a squirrel. We're like, ooh, gross, pests and critters and bugs, and that's disgusting. And I want nothing to do with it. So how do you get them over, ooh, icky things versus, well, these are things that help us stay healthy as a planet. So those are my two questions for you.
Yeah, really good questions. And I live beside, a couple of master gardeners. And so they have immaculate gardens and very few opportunities to really get into what you're talking about. So some people are going to want to stay where they are, but the more a number of us start to make different additions and it looks attractive and it doesn't look like, in a longer version of this talk, I talk about the hippie garden, which is totally overgrown. And it's like, yeah, I'm doing this for nature. And a lot of people look at it and just kind of go, oof, that's not for me. So it really is about creating some sort of model and leading by example. And then you'll get the people that are kind of in between that will start to join. And before you know it, when people start to talk about things, like I also didn't show, I planted a hop tree, which is the food source for the largest butterfly in North America, the giant swallowtail. It's gorgeous. Within 20 minutes of putting in a 5-foot hop tree, a female swallowtail came over and laid eggs on it. And the eggs turn into what looks like a bird dropping, the caterpillar, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's like this big. And then you see that it turns into this gorgeous butterfly. And so it really does happen slowly over time, but it's not necessarily too slow. And, part of me thought, oh, this is too slow because we really need to act and change right now. But the way like adopters go, right? That bell curve, right? People at the beginning are really going to jump on. And then by the time we get enough people, those people in the middle will say, oh, geez, I really have to join in. Not just because I want that, but everybody's talking about it and everybody's doing it. So I should do it too, right? So that's what I've found in a lot of these cases. And then actually the ants in my property have been moving some of these plants to my neighbors. And they're thinking, are you like coming over and putting in some of these plants? I'm like, no, it's not me. It's the opportunity to have the conversation. And so, in a lot of cases, they remove the plants, but then I say, that's a trillium. And I haven't had trilliums reproduce in my property yet, but the ants have planted them there. In both cases, my neighbors have left them growing and maybe move them. So that's really how it's going to help. We need allies like ants and other things to help move it across. Long answer. Sorry.
Jerry.
Ben, do you still organize the Shinrin-yoku forest walks in London? I know you used to do them in Toronto, but I'm not sure if you do them in London.
Yeah, the forest therapy or the Shinjin-yoku, which is forest bathing, I don't lead as many of the walks anymore. I'm now a trainer with the Global Institute of Forest Therapy. This modality is from Japan. It's called the Ancient Modern Practice, and we now train 100 people across the world every year to become certified guides. And what I love about the forest therapy is that it really helps people reconnect to nature. And of course, now there's close to 40 years of research that shows us that, it'll drop our cortisol level. So our stress hormones are totally reduced. It can shrink, in some cases, eliminate tumors. There's so much health research that has shown not just being outside nature, but being led on some of these walks is super healthy for us. So yeah, that website is giftoftheforest.com. And thanks for bringing it up. It's a really big part of my life now. And we're training in Costa Rica and in Europe and the Azores and all sorts of places over Canada. So it's been wonderful to go to those places, but the main purpose is to train people there so that that modality can be led locally. So.
And Ian.
I had a couple of questions. One, you mentioned trilliums and maidenhairs, and I thought, are you planting those from seeds? Or I thought it was not legal to transplant trilliums from public areas or maidenhairs or things like this.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I wanted to ask was about invasive plants. And I have a perfect example in my garden. I planted a small fig tree a couple of years ago, and now it's just gone crazy. And I think I'm going to have to dig it up and stop it going crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll try to be brief with this. The trilliums, we have 6 species. One's endangered. You're not allowed to touch that. All the other trilliums, if they're in a conservation authority or in a park, you're not allowed to dig those. But if you have somebody that you know that has a property and they have thousands of trilliums, it's perfectly legal to dig those out. You have to make sure your shovel is clean without any seeds from invasive species, and that you cover up the holes so that cover it up with leaves. But it's a really good way to get some of those fungi and bacteria, the native fungi and bacteria. I didn't have those in my garden for 10 years until I started doing some transplants, and that's when the plants really started to thrive. So it's a bit of an urban legend that you can't transplant trilliums. And maidenhair fern as well. It's a common species. You're certainly welcome to do that if you have permission somewhere, but be respectful and make sure that the numbers are good. Remember that the trilliums will live for 30 years. And so it's kind of a long-lived plant. So if you overharvest them in an area, or if you pick them just as flowers to bring home, they won't get enough energy to revitalize the bulbs, and they won't flower for several years, and they may even die. So that's one of the reasons. But if you get a good root ball and you get permission, certainly you can establish them. Invasive species, so the top ones that I would mention are European buckthorn. Generally, nobody plants those now except for birds, but they have bright blueberries, dark blueberries that are found all over London, and the city has spent over $1 million removing them from our natural areas. They'll show up on our properties and germinate themselves, as will burning bush. So burning bush, things like periwinkle, and what are 2 or 3 of the others? These are plants not to buy from nurseries. These are plants that probably won't be available in nurseries within 5 to 10 years, because it's been shown to cause us millions of dollars of these plants that once they're established, they go like crazy. As far as I know, fig trees, even though the fig will grow large itself if you protect it somewhat in the winter, I don't think that will germinate and spread. So I would say just keep going with it and kind of prune it down a little bit. Make sure you protect it. I love fig fruit. And sometimes this structure provides important habitat for wildlife. If it's well established, and I would say, if you had things like buckthorn and it's got a good structure, take it out anyway. It's so detrimental to the environment, because buckthorn, burning bush, things like Japanese honeysuckle, these things replace all of our native shrubs. They totally shade out our ground layer, so we can't have trilliums or ferns or anything to grow there. So those are the ones to stay away from and remove from your garden if you can.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question. Bob Early.
Okay, great presentation, Ben.
Thanks, Bob.
I was going to mention, I'm kind of the oddball in the family. I'm not that much into environment, but my daughter is living off the grid up in Manitoulin, does a lot of outdoor education and forest bathing. And then I've got a nephew that's been down to Peely and writing articles about birds. Anyway, my partner is concerned about the depletion of wood warblers. And I don't know if you know anything about that, but if you have any insight, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, what's the issue with wood warblers? Sorry.
Well, the depletion, the numbers of them. So if you're aware of it or not.
Yeah. So the wood warblers, for anybody who might not know, we have between 20 and 30 species. that will migrate through London in April and May. And we have like 4 or 5 species that stay here and breed. Most of the rest will go to central Ontario or up in the Arctic to breed for the summertime and then come back again in September and migrate through. The main issue is the fact that climate change is really playing havoc with the insects of when they're coming out. So in the springtime, as you can imagine, when they're migrating through, if the climate is so different and it's changing when the insects are coming out, like for example, we get sometimes super warm days in March. A lot of the insects will wake up, breed, die, and then the birds aren't coming through until mid-April to mid-May. So a lot of those insects are gone, and they'll die. And similarly, when we get snow more frequently, like we do in April and May, that snow will kill a lot of the insects. And a lot of those birds have spent all that time flying back from Central and South America, and there's no food, right? So that's one of the biggest things. The other thing is in addition to climate change, is that without planting a lot of native plants, we don't have as many insects. And I think it was what was your name again, mentioned, without these insects, the birds aren't surviving, but also, without the native plants, but also with these invasive plants that have taken over a lot of our natural areas, we have so few numbers of species of native plants that we have such a smaller range of insects to feed them. So like our native warblers will be yellow warbler, the orange crowned warbler. We have 5 or 6 warbler species, the common yellowthroat. Those ones are really dependent on the plants that we have around here. Whereas the other ones, the 20 to 25 species that are migrating further north, that's more of a climate change issue. And now in some places like North Africa and other parts of Europe, people are starting to eat songbirds, actually. So, there are a lot of pressures being put on already declining populations. And you probably know that since 1950, our songbird populations have been reduced by 60% in North America. And one of those factors is also cats. Our cats that we allow to go outside, our house cats, account for 1 billion songbirds that are killed each year. And then there are window strikes, right? Because people don't have protections on the windows that show them they can't fly through them. So yeah, a lot of impacts that are going, and they're all solvable, right? So this is the thing, we all take a little step, cumulatively, we're going to have a really big impact.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben. Very interesting, very applicable presentation today. I'm looking forward to the release of your webinar series and learning more about native plants and animals and what we can do. In recognition of your presentation to our club today, a contribution has been made to the Polio Plus campaign of the Rotary Foundation to immunize 50 infants against polio. Because of you, Rotary is one step closer to a polio-free world. So thank you very much. You're welcome to stick around now and enjoy the next 15 minutes of the meeting. If you have other commitments, please feel free to leave as well and go take them.
Thanks so much, everybody. I appreciate meeting a few of you and seeing you. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
So Jim Belton, you have some quick announcements about our meeting next week.
Thank you, President Don. Next week, the Rotary Club of London and the Rotary Club of London Foundation will be holding their AGMs. And we'll be sending out today the package for the club AGM. And as soon as I get the information from the foundation for their AGM, I will send that out to everybody as well. In our agenda, the usual accountant prepared year-end financial statements and the minutes for last year's meeting. And the treasurer's comments will be there as well. In addition, for this year, the strategic planning group came back with some things we need to look at in our Constitution, as well as our bylaws. And so a couple of us have gone through the Constitution and bylaws, and we'll be including this in the package. One will be the worksheet, so it'll show you what the old Constitution and the old bylaws were, and what we did to make the changes, and some of it, why that was done. And then there will also be the official proposed constitution, as well as proposed bylaw. And so we'll be asking for everybody to take a look at that before the meeting. And when I go to make the presentation, hopefully you will have gone through it and maybe have some questions, which I'll try to answer. So that we can indeed come up with the approval for those. So yes, everything will be going out to the active members of the club and the satellite active members, because we all are the voting people for the Rotary Club of London and the Rotary Club of London Foundation.
Thank you very much, Jim. Next announcement is 2 fellowship items. The first one is looking for feedback from everyone attending today as to interest in a virtual or in-person Christmas event this year. So there is a poll on the screen in front of you that allow you to vote. I'm just looking for some feedback as to what we should try to plan for Christmas, and making sure we understand what people's preferences are and how comfortable they are with getting together in person again. The second fellowship item is the Satellite Club is holding a fellowship event next Tuesday. That's November 30th at 6:30 p.m. at the Poacher's Arms. I think their tagline for the event is "Come for the fellowship, stay for the Korean fried chicken." The new owners at the Poacher's Arm is a former exchange student and a prospective member of the Satellite Club. So they're looking to have a good time there. So if you want to attend, I will definitely be there next Tuesday, and I will definitely be enjoying the Korean fried chicken because it's wonderful. And I will keep the poll open just a little bit longer. Are there any other announcements for the club?
I'd just like to point out that our first Salvation Army shifts are coming up this Friday. I did send out a shift sheet so that all the people that are going to be attending should have received that. And if there are any discrepancies there, I'd ask you to get in touch with me. But all the instructions are there. And if you're around Angelo's over the next few weeks, drop by and drop some money into the kettle.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. To wrap up our meeting, I am going to just share the results from our Christmas party poll on the screen. Thank you very much for all the responses. Just a reminder about the upcoming week or week and a bit. From a Rotary perspective, our meeting next week will be the annual meetings of the club and the foundation. On next Tuesday, the Satellite Club Fellowship event at the Poacher's Arms. And I have the wrong date down for our next board meeting because the next board meeting will be in December. As always, cocktail hour tomorrow night at 5 p.m. and coffee clutch Thursday at 10:30 a.m. And once again, a reminder to serve, to change lives. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful week.